Hello everyone and welcome to our module on neurotransmitters. So in this video, what I'm going to focus on is neurotransmitters used by neurons in the brain as part of the central nervous system. Before we get into all that, I just want to briefly mention the neurotransmitters that are used by the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system really uses just a small handful of neurotransmitters to carry out its functions. The main neurotransmitters are norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and dopamine. And talk about all of these in other videos where I discuss how the peripheral nervous system works. So these three neurotransmitters are used to activate peripheral structures by the peripheral nervous system. So for example, in skeletal muscle, if you want it to contract, that's where acetylcholine is important as part of the somatic nervous system. In places where you find smooth muscle, like in arterioles, that's where you can find norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter working as part of the autonomic nervous system. In contrast, the central nervous system, meaning the neurons of the brain and the spinal cord, use a much larger group of neurotransmitters to carry out complex functions like memory and emotions and things like that. Some of the key central nervous system neurotransmitters are the ones I've listed on this slide. These include norepinephrine and dopamine, also GABA and serotonin, and also acetylcholine and glutamate. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of this video is talk about these central nervous system neurotransmitters, including where they're produced within the brain and also the different functions that they're associated with. So let's start by talking about norepinephrine, which in terms of the central nervous system is a major stress or panic hormone. Now in the peripheral nervous system, norepinephrine does lots of other things like contracts smooth muscle, but here I'm talking about what it does in the neurons in the central nervous system, like in the brain. And higher levels of activity of this neurotransmitter are seen in states where there is stress or panic going on in the brain. So for example, you tend to see increased levels of norepinephrine activity as a neurotransmitter in patients who have anxiety. High norepinephrine activity is associated with anxiety. Also, decreased levels of norepinephrine are associated with depression. And in fact, in the videos on depression in the psychiatry section, I talk about antidepressants, and many of those raise norepinephrine levels. Some of the different drug types that boost norepinephrine levels in the brain include the SNRIs, tricyclic antidepressants like desipramine, and monoamine oxidase inhibitors. All these drugs boost norepinephrine levels in the central nervous system in the brain, and that can sometimes be helpful in resolving symptoms of depression. The place where most of the norepinephrine neurotransmitter for the central nervous system is produced is called the locus ceruleus. It's a structure found in the back of the pons near the fourth ventricle. So if you look at this drawing on the slide here, this is the locus ceruleus. It's right here in the back of the pons, very close to the fourth ventricle, which is right here in front of the cerebellum. And this is the major source of norepinephrine in the brain and the central nervous system. This region is critical for response to stress. It has extensive projections that activate under stress, and that's why norepinephrine is the major stress or panic hormone. In particular, one of the best studied examples of when the locus ceruleus becomes active is in opiate withdrawal. So patients in opiate withdrawal have a very hyperactive state, lots of stress activity going on, agitation, and a lot of this is driven by high norepinephrine levels in the brain due to a very active locus ceruleus producing norepinephrine. Okay, our next central nervous system neurotransmitter we'll discuss is dopamine. So dopamine is synthesized in the midbrain in two regions. One's called the ventral tegmental area, shown here. The other is called the substantia nigra. And levels of dopamine, either being high or low, are associated with a number of disease states. First of all, in patients who have depression, dopamine levels in the central nervous system tend to be decreased. You also see decreased levels of dopamine-producing neurons in patients who have Parkinson's disease, which I talk about in other videos. In schizophrenia and many psychotic disorders, there are increased levels of dopamine activity, and the way we treat schizophrenia and many forms of psychosis is with drugs that block dopamine in the central nervous system. Now let me pause here from our discussion of central nervous system neurotransmitters and briefly mention an important region of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. This region of the brain is very important for pleasure, reward, and also addictive behaviors, including drug addiction. If you look at this drawing on the slide, this is where the nucleus accumbens is located. It's part of the so-called mesolimbic dopamine pathway, and basically this is a pathway that's very important for rewarding us for behaviors that are pleasurable. It's sometimes called the reward pathway. And so research has shown that the nucleus accumbens is activated in drug addiction. This is high yield to remember. So patients who are addicted to drugs like nicotine or cocaine or opioids, they are getting a pleasure response from the nucleus accumbens that is driving their addiction. There's also research showing that the nucleus accumbens is very active in patients in the setting of fear states. And in terms of neurotransmitters, the nucleus accumbens really collects information from lots of different neurotransmitter activity. So several neurotransmitters have inputs to this region of the brain. This includes dopamine from the VTA, which we talked about in the last slide, also glutamate and GABA, which we'll talk about later. But basically, inputs from all these different neurotransmitters are sort of synthesized together in the nucleus accumbens, and that's what drives our response to things that are pleasurable. Okay, our next central nervous system neurotransmitter is GABA. GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid, and it is a key inhibitory neurotransmitter of the central nervous system. And what I mean by this is that it tends to suppress central nervous system activity. So it has a generally sedating effect, and activating GABA receptors can help stop seizures and things like that because it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's synthesized not in one specific location like dopamine and norepinephrine. Instead, there are so-called GABAergic neurons found throughout the CNS, and they make GABA. And in terms of disease states, things to know about GABA are, first of all, that decreased levels are found in patients who have anxiety. And hopefully that makes sense to you. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So when the levels are low, there tends to be more central nervous system activity, and that's what you see in patients who have anxiety. Also, Huntington's disease, which I talk about in other videos, is classic for a disorder associated with decreased levels of GABA. The way GABA works is it binds to a receptor and it allows more chloride to go into neuron cells. When this happens, you get a hyperpolarized neuron, which means that it's harder for the neuron to depolarize, and therefore it's less excitable. And so this is how GABA exerts its relatively inhibitory effects in the central nervous system, by driving chloride into neurons and making the neuron hyperpolarized so it's harder for it to depolarize and transmit a signal. And so because GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that tends to produce calmness and sedation, there are a lot of drugs that work through GABA. So first of all, there are many anesthetics that activate GABA receptors. I talk about these in the anesthesia section. This includes drugs like etomidate, propofol. Benzodiazepines are famous drugs for activating the GABA receptor, so are barbiturates. Zolpidem, which is sometimes prescribed as a sedative to help people sleep, works through GABA. And then alcohol also increases GABA activity of the brain. That's one of the reasons patients can become more calm sometimes when they drink alcohol. The bottom line here is that because GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, any drug that activates or enhances the GABA receptor or GABA function is going to lead to relative sedation of the central nervous system. GABA is synthesized from another neurotransmitter in the central nervous system that we'll talk about later called glutamate. There's an enzyme called glutamate decarboxylase. It converts glutamate into GABA. Then there's another enzyme called GABA transaminase, which breaks down GABA into various breakdown products. Both of these enzymes shown here on this slide require vitamin B6 as a cofactor. So the reason I'm telling you this is because in patients who have a B6 deficiency, which I talk about in videos in the biochemistry section, they will have low levels of GABA in their central nervous system. And this is one of the reasons that these patients can develop seizures. They can have general neuron hyperexcitability in the central nervous system from low GABA, and that's what can lead to the seizures seen in patients who have a severe B6 vitamin deficiency. This is just sort of a fine detail that I just mentioned, so you've heard of it, but there are 3 GABA receptor subtypes. GABA A and GABA B are found in the brain. GABA C is found in the retina. Most drugs work through the GABA A receptor, so all these drugs here, which I talked about a few slides ago, they all work through the GABA A receptor to increase that chloride ion flux into neurons to hyperpolarize the neurons. In the infectious disease section, I talk about tetanus, which is a condition that can arise if you have infection with the bacteria Clostridium tetani. This bacteria produces a very potent exotoxin that prevents the release of glycine, which is one neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, and also GABA. And so by preventing release of GABA, what you get is overactivity in the central nervous system. And so that can lead to things like muscle spasms and also hyperreflexia in joints. Other classic features are all related to overactivity of muscles that you see in tetanus. So trismus, which means lockjaw, is a restricted mouth opening, classic feature of tetanus. Opisthotonos means an arched back from spasms. This is a picture of that condition in a baby. This is also a classic feature of tetanus. And the reason I'm bringing all this up here is just to remind you that part of the reason that tetanus causes these clinical features is by preventing the release of glycine and GABA from neurons. Those are both inhibitory neurotransmitters, and therefore you get overactivity of neurons leading to muscle spasms. Okay, our next central nervous system neurotransmitter we'll discuss is serotonin, also known as 5-hydroxytryptamine or 5-HT. Serotonin has a whole bunch of different functions in the central nervous system, and as we'll discuss, it's important in a number of disease states. It's synthesized in a region of the brainstem called the Raphe nuclei, which are a series of nuclei shown here in the brainstem. They produce serotonin. And in terms of disease states, there are decreased levels in patients who have anxiety and also patients who have depression. And so many antidepressants boost serotonin levels. That's how they work. I talk about all these drugs in videos in the psychiatry section, but SSRIs, SNRIs, and MAO inhibitors all boost serotonin levels, and that can be useful in the treatment of depression, also in some cases in the treatment of anxiety disorders. And once again, I discuss antidepressant drugs in detail in the psychiatry section, but on this slide, I've just showed you the names of some of these drugs so that you will have seen them at least once. These are the major SSRIs here. These are SNRIs, and these are MAO inhibitors. All of these drugs, through one mechanism or another, will boost the levels of serotonin effects in the central nervous system, and that can be useful in treating depression and also anxiety and some other disorders. If patients overdose on a drug that boosts serotonin levels in the central nervous system, or if a patient takes two drugs at the same time that boost serotonin levels, they can potentially develop the serotonin syndrome. This is a clinical syndrome that has a classic triad of features, and it's associated with any drug that can boost serotonin levels in the central nervous system. So you can see it with all of the antidepressants we've already talked about. You can also see it with tricyclic antidepressants, and there are also some other drugs which aren't antidepressants but happen to boost serotonin levels in the central nervous system. They can produce the serotonin syndrome. So the triad of features of this syndrome is, first of all, mental status changes. So patients can develop anxiety and delirium. They can be restless and also disoriented. The second feature of the triad is autonomic hyperactivity. So this is overactivity of the autonomic nervous system. So patients can be sweaty. They can be tachycardic. They can also have an increased body temperature. That's hyperthermia. And then lastly, there are characteristic neuromuscular abnormalities. These are things like tremor of muscles or clonus. You can also see hyperreflexia and bilateral Babinski signs. There's another clinical syndrome that can be triggered by drugs that looks a lot like the serotonin syndrome. This is called the neuroleptic malignant syndrome, or NMS. This is caused by excessive dopamine blockade, not from overactivity of serotonin. This usually occurs in patients who are taking antipsychotic drugs that block dopamine. But just like the serotonin syndrome, NMS can have muscle rigidity and fever and change in mental status and autonomic instability. It's very hard to distinguish these two syndromes from each other clinically. Mostly the way you're going to recognize one or the other in a board question is by the drug that triggered the syndrome. If it's a serotonin type drug, then it's going to be the serotonin syndrome. If it's a dopamine blocking drug, then it's going to be the neuroleptic malignant syndrome. There are some slight differences between the two clinical syndromes. In neuromuscular syndrome, patients classically develop what's called the lead pipe rigidity, meaning all their muscles are contracted, and this leads to very high creatine kinase levels. In serotonin syndrome, patients usually develop clonus, which is sort of like a spasm of muscles, but it's not the lead pipe rigidity. They can have high CK levels, but they're usually not as high as NMS. And then finally, the treatment for the serotonin syndrome is a special drug called cyproheptadine. It's a serotonin antagonist, and it blocks the effects of serotonin syndrome in the brain, and that minimizes the clinical features of the syndrome. Okay, our next central nervous system neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. So in terms of the central nervous system, acetylcholine is synthesized in a region of the subcortex called the basal nucleus of Meynert. And then this region of the subcortex sends projections all over the place in the central nervous system, and that's how acetylcholine exerts its effects. Increased or decreased activity of acetylcholine is associated with a number of disease and also normal physiologic states. So first of all, elevated levels of acetylcholine activity are a classic finding in patients during REM sleep. Also, decreased levels are associated with Alzheimer's disease, and there are a couple of drugs that can be used to treat Alzheimer's, and they boost acetylcholine levels in the brain to try to minimize the effects of the disease. And then lastly, Huntington's disease, which I go into detail in other videos, is associated with decreased levels of acetylcholine, just like Alzheimer's. Okay, moving on, our next neurotransmitter we'll discuss is glutamate. So glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter of the central nervous system. So you can think of it sort of like the opposite of GABA. GABA is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter. Glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter. One confusing thing about glutamate that you just have to know is that the receptor it binds is not called the glutamate receptor. Instead, it's called the NMDA receptor. This stands for N-methyl D-aspartate, and it got this name because of the way it was initially discovered. but basically this is the receptor in the central nervous system that binds glutamate. Glutamate has been shown to have a bunch of different associations within the central nervous system. It's been associated with memory, learning, also addiction. One thing to know is that Huntington's disease, which is a neurodegenerative condition, is associated with neuronal death from glutamate toxicity, meaning too much glutamate activity. What happens is glutamate binds to its receptor, that NMDA receptor in Huntington's disease, and it does this to an excessive degree. And so you get lots of influx of calcium into neurons from all this binding of glutamate, and that leads to neuronal cell death. And that's part of the underlying pathophysiology of Huntington's disease. Phencyclidine, also called PCP, is a drug of abuse. It's also sometimes called angel dust. And the mechanism of action of this drug is that it's an antagonist or blocker of the NMDA receptor. To understand the clinical features you will see in patients who take PCP, you have to appreciate that glutamate, through binding to its NMDA receptor, normally boosts GABA activity in the central nervous system. So when you block this NMDA receptor, you don't get this boost in GABA activity, and you get a fall in GABA activity. That's going to lead to overactivity in general in the central nervous system. And that's what you see in patients who take PCP. They can develop violent behavior, they can have hallucinations, they can have things like ataxia, which is loss of balance, and nystagmus, which is a finding on examination of the eyes. You also see sympathetic nervous system activation, so they can develop hypertension, tachycardia, and diaphoresis, and potentially PCP can lead to seizures, coma, or death. But the thing to know, especially for board exams, is that this drug blocks the NMDA receptor, and that leads to central nervous system overactivity and all of these clinical features. I'll briefly mention glycine. There's not much to say about this as a neurotransmitter. Glycine is actually a non-essential amino acid. You can find it in lots of structures in the human body, like collagen and heme, but in the central nervous system, it is used in some places as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And in terms of pathology, the main thing to remember about glycine is what I told you earlier, is that its release is inhibited in the central nervous system in patients who have tetanus, along with GABA release as well. Okay, and then I'll finish this video by talking about substance P. So substance P is a polypeptide or protein neurotransmitter, and it's involved in the transmission of a number of pain syndromes. It binds to a receptor called NK1, which stands for neurokinin 1 receptor. And there are a couple of drugs that interact with NK1 and substance P that you should know about. First of all is a drug called caspacin. This is a drug sometimes used in patients who have chronic neuropathic pain. And what it does is it desensitizes pain neurons and it depletes them of substance P. And so this has been shown in some clinical studies to improve the severity of pain in patients who have chronic neuropathic pain. And then there are also two drugs called aprepitant and fosaprepitant that are NK1 receptor antagonists. They block the NK1 receptor. And these drugs have been shown to be helpful in patients who have chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And that concludes our module on neurotransmitters.